This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
So if you walk into a Chinese roasted duck restaurant, you will not smell it like roasted steak because the amino acid in the duck skin is different from that in the beef. So that's how it would affect the flavor profile, but then the amount would affect the flavor stability, for example.
This week on the show, our final live episode from the 2019 Craft Brewers Conference in Denver. This episode is packed with pearls of wisdom from the brain trust at RAR Malting Company. All right, so we're here at the Craft Brewers Conference in Denver with Dr. Yin and Dr. Pattie, the hydrogenator. Aron, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to explain that at all or no?
Yes. The hydrogenator is my alter ego. So it's my version of being a beer superhero.
Perfect.
And she did it.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so for those of you who have no idea what's going on, there was an arm wrestling contest here at the CBC last night, which Pattie participated in. Okay, well, anyway, we're here. You guys are about to give a presentation on beer flavor stability, especially as it relates to malt. We're going to give listeners some practical advice for best practices to improve flavor stability. But first, let's give an overview of the different beer staling mechanisms that are relevant here.
Sure. There are quite a few ways that beer can begin to stale, starting from raw material quality all the way through malting practice. We could even extend that into hop processing as well if you want to go that avenue. Optimization throughout the malt house, as well as how we produce the beer. Different parameters that we can adjust throughout the brewing process and finishing process. So we can start with raw materials and go all the way through production, whether it's on the raw material side or the final product side. Of the major staling mechanisms, most of them relate to oxidation, so presence of oxygen. However, even in the absence of oxygen, we can have some staling mechanisms occurring due to the presence of either free radicals or specific compounds or molecules that will just either degrade over time into other molecules or change shape into other molecules over time, or follow pathways that are accelerated through the presence of other free radicals.
Okay, so let's look at a few examples of that. Let's dig a little bit deep into, lipoxygenase and the whole trans-2-nonenal pathway. We won't go too deep, but let's just talk about that on a high level.
Yes, certainly. I think one of the mechanisms is really the production of papery or cardboardy note in the beer, and that is a result of lipid degradation and lipid and fatty acid oxidation. And that is catalyzed by an enzyme called the lipoxygenase, particularly one of the isoamylase enzymes like lipoxygenase 1, LOX1, and that is really oxidizing the degraded the lipid to fatty acid, then all the way to trans to nolenol, which is really a very stale compound at very, very low threshold, like a 0.15 ppb level in regular beers.
Okay, and then heat stress is another area that a lot of brewers may not have on their radar. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. In the brewing process, the beer can undergo heat stress, and we measure that. There is an index called the thiobarbiturate acid index, TBI. And basically, it's the production of melanoidins or other compounds that can become free radicals or just compounds that give a staling note. One index of heat staling is the presence or the increase in furforaldehyde or phenylacetaldehyde as well. So those are two staling compounds that we see increase due to heat stress. They may not impact the flavor so readily as some other compounds, but they can be used to understand whether or not the beer has undergone heat stress in terms of production or post-package stress during aging.
All right, very good. And then there's another beer staling mechanism that has to do with amino acids. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. Normally, I think in adjunct beers, that is not really an issue because you really dilute the free amino nitrogen to quite a large degree. However, in all malt brewing, you would very likely to end up with excess amount of free amino nitrogen in the beer, and those free amino nitrogen materials could be substrate for a reaction called Strecker degradation. Then they turn those amino acids into stale aldehyde, and those stale aldehyde can have very low threshold and can really generate a series of off notes like a soy saucy note, very malty note, or sometimes even meaty brothy notes. All those type of off flavors could be due to the reaction from excess amount of free amino nitrogen that yeast could not use up in fermentation.
What can that amino acid profile of a given barley tell us brewers?
So the free amino nitrogen rather, in terms of amino acids, so broken down into just its amino acids, can tell you the available amino acids for the yeast. So yeast require a certain lower level of amino acids to function and to reproduce and also go through their cellular processes and make ethanol and all of that. When you have the excess of certain amino acids, the yeast will either uptake them or not uptake them. It's called the ordered uptake issue. So there are some amino acids that yeast will uptake, but not until much later in the fermentation. There are some that they uptake very readily because they need them to reproduce. Proline, for example, is not an amino acid that yeast can assimilate, so they don't uptake it at all. So if we look at the free amino nitrogen profiles of various barley varieties or malt types, then we can understand what's available for the yeast in terms of free amino acids and what could potentially be left over in terms of extra leftover amino acids that could become staling compounds during aging.
All right, let's get into some of the beer staling preventative measures that you guys are planning to give brewers as some practical advice, and especially during malt. Start off with those that are during malt handling and milling. So lipoxygenase activity actually decreases with storage. Why is that?
Yeah, that is a mechanism people have not studied a lot, but definitely from studies in Europe or North America, people find that the apparent LOX1 level goes down as the malt storage time goes up. And normally it occurs in the first 2 to 3 weeks to a large degree. Then the deduction is relatively low. So it could be due to some maybe extractability, or could be due to the enzyme rearrangement, etc. But nobody has really published a lot on that. That's certainly an area we can study more, therefore we can handle that properly.
Is it a significant difference? I mean, is it the kind of thing where a brewer needs to really make sure, hey, I'm not using malt that is only a week old?
Yes, normally you see quite significant amount of reduction, maybe up to 30-50% reduction. But we do not know whether that enzyme, while in the mold, catalyze the reaction or not, because there's also another method called nominal potential, and there's a possibility the enzyme may have reacted with some of the substrate there, and it just lost its activity. So it's a whole complex of studies we need to work on yet to understand that better.
Okay, what else matters during malt handling and milling?
I think that during the milling particularly, you'll be talking about several issues. One is that a lot of the LOX1 activities is in the germ or the embryo pod. And therefore, when you mill it, you try not to break those tissues into very, very fine particles, because then the enzyme could be easily extracted. And then in some other cases, you may have the option using wet milling, for example. Therefore, the temperature setting would be very critical. The LOX1 enzyme is active below 50 C or 55 C. So some people would simply raise the temperature to 60 C or above when they do the striking. Therefore, you don't give the LOX1 enzyme chance to work on the fatty acid. Therefore, you prevent that step to happen, and you generate less substrate for transtenolenol later on. And of course, getting away from exposure to oxygen, like using some other like nitrogen or CO2 blanketing, also that might also help as well.
Okay, so it sounds like a coarse grind. If you don't have wet milling, a coarse grind is your friend in this situation, right?
Yeah, if that's its only concern, yes.
Okay, and how about let's hear some more about mashing, and what are some of the other best practice defenses against beer staling in regards to mashing?
I think it's very similar, but in this case, it will not be just on LOX1. Yes, if you are mashing at relatively gentle temperature, like around 50 C or so, you would allow the LOX1 enzyme to react with fatty acid and produce a lot of substrates. However, if you raise the temperature over to 60 or above, that's C, and then you would certainly help to eliminate that. On the other hand, later on, we may touch a little bit more on the free amino nitrogen level as well, because the typical proteolysis, which is also at low temperature, normally 40 C or 45 C or below, you also generate more free amino nitrogen. That would be the substrate for the Strecker degradation aldehyde formation later on. And then the pH as well, how they favor the enzymes. So there's a balance of action. You can control that. However, you still have to want to make sure you degrade the beta-glucans if that is an issue. So the brewers and the maltsters need to work together to choose the optimal mashing regime there. I think it's critical the brewers look at everything all together, including, for example, do I have enough free amino nitrogen, particularly if I use adjunct? Do I have enough beta-glucan degradation? Should I provide beta-glucanase, the optimum condition to react? Or maybe I just look after more like stopping the reaction of LOX1 and those enzymes. So the brewer will have to look into that. One is temperature optimal, the other is pH optimal, and then choose the best way they think suitable for their processes and product quality.
And of course, like you said before, keeping oxygen out of the process as much as possible. So anything we can do to minimize, splashing or entraining air in the mash as well, right?
Yeah, that's always the case from the hot side to the cold side. Yes, how you would pump your mash into the vessel, for example, whether you drop it from the top or pump it from the bottom of the vessel, those things are probably already factors the brewers are well considering that already.
And let's move on into lautering. Is there anything else to add there that's new?
On the lautering, of course, particularly at the high temperature range, you are already starting the thermal load build up. And also, you probably read in some of the journals, they said a lot of the free radicals formed in the malting, particularly in the kilning or roasting process, the free radicals reside more in the husks. So if you do a lot of exhaustive extraction, you would not only build up the thermal load, but also you would extract a lot of those free radicals and possibly some oxidized polyphenols. Those are not really quite antioxidant, they may be more pro-oxidant. So normally you wanted to control that to a moderate level rather than very exhaustive.
Coming up.
I think that's why some of those large international all malt brewers, they send their beer all over the world, but the beer seems to be okay because I think that's one of the processes they control relatively well.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
additional support provided by
Whitcomb Selinsky McCullough PC serves all brewers in registering and protecting trademarks, navigating the label approval process, and assisting with OSHA inspections and safety compliance. Please go to wsmlawpc.com for more information.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. The 58th Annual District Caribbean Convention joins forces with District Southeast in Miami May 2nd to the 5th. This is going to be a big meeting with lots of great presenters, including folks who've been on this podcast. Joe Hertrick, Andrew Fradiani, John Mallett, Roy Johnson, Dr. John Paul May, Andy Tavikram, and more. District Philly also meets May 3rd at 2SP Brewing. If you're barrel aging, don't miss the May 9th webinar screening for Lactobacillus acetotolerans in a brewery setting. District Northwest meets in beautiful Hood River May 10th and 11th. District St. Paul, Minneapolis meets May 16th at the Star Keller in New Ulm. District St. Louis is at Old Bakery Brewery May 16th. The District Southeast Spring Meeting and 4th Annual Crawfish Boil is May 17th and 18th in Tampa, and District Northern Illinois meets at Half Acre Beer May 31st. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full count of events at MBAA.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Talk about the impact thermal stress has on beer flavor stability and how it should be managed during wort boiling.
Yeah, I think the wort boiling is another process. You would do many things. Of course, you want to evaporate the DMS off notes. You want to coagulate the proteins. Those are all good. However, at the same time, you are adding a lot of heat load, thermal load. And those will be, like Pattie was mentioning, will be reflected by the high TBI index. And if you measure the free radical formation over the boiling process, the free radical level really goes up as you boil more and more because you are forming a lot of melanoiding product and you are oxidizing the reductones, etc. You are really giving it not really a lot of pro-antioxidant potential. You are oxidizing a lot of the product. So if you are not going to concentrate your wort a lot through boiling, or if you have sufficient protein aggregation already and you don't have a lot of DMS issues, long boiling may not be very helpful for flavor stability.
What levers do we have to play with in regards to affecting beer flavor stability in the whirlpool and during wort chilling?
Yeah, I think the whirlpool one is very similar to the boiling in the kettle. So every moment you are residing your wort in the whirlpool, you are adding more chance to build more heat stress. And of course, if there's presence of oxygen, you are really favoring those type of reactions as well. So if you were measuring the nominal potential, you'll find that that process is very much related to that. So you may not be able to taste the staleness in the wort or in the fresh beer, but you already build a lot of substrate through that process. So that's one important part. The other important part is, yes, in that case, once you achieve your sedimentation, etc., you should cool it as quickly as possible. And then, so when you are exposing the wort to oxygen, you have less oxidation. And of course, the tube formation is another one. So in the traditional brewing science, you wanted to accumulate as much tube as possible so that the precipitate that has probably a lot of fatty acid products, etc., and proteins would settle down and get separated. Yeast would love those. However, those would form precursors for oxidation later on in the fermentation and then in the beer storage later on, because they do carry a lot of fatty material, and you notice that you don't need a lot to do the.
So it's not going to utilize it all if you end up carrying it. Yeah, yeah. Okay. There are quite a few flavor stability watch-outs during fermentation and maturation, most of which are, once again, related to oxygen. What advice do you have there?
Yeah, on that one, I think it's more the yeast viability and how it will be, how happy the yeast is in fermentation, because that produces a lot of kind of antioxidant or reducing power. And SO2 is a typical example. If you produce a certain amount, not too high, it would help keeping the beer fresh. I think those are important. And also maybe how vigorously you are growing the yeast, how much the yeast are multiplying, because yeast has a lot of proteins in it, and if they are multiplying, they would also absorb a lot of the free amino nitrogen. Normally we say as a general rule, you don't need more than 15 ppm of free amino nitrogen per plate of wort, but if you have a good yeast growth there, it would pick up a lot of the residual free amino nitrogen. Therefore, you would reduce the precursors for Strecker degradation later on. I think that's why some of those large international all malt brewers, they send their beer all over the world, but the beer seems to be okay, because I think that's one of the processes they control relatively well, from the mashing to the fermentation to the maturation. And of course, in there, if you're filtering the beer with diatomaceous earth, then iron is another factor. You're trying to eliminate the input of iron from that at that stage as well. Of course, yeast would absorb a lot of those. That's, again, going back to yeast viability and vitality as well.
Yeah, I think when you get into fermentation, you start to look at the introduction of off flavors or flavor precursors that will lead to off flavors during aging of beer. Yeast vitality and viability, as Dr. Xiang said, are fairly important. Another thing is making sure that you get your beer off your yeast in a timely manner, because yeast bioaccumulate a lot of different molecules. They will bioaccumulate some amino acids, and then they will also bioaccumulate metals. So if you're doing serial repitching, those kinds of things, you want to really pay attention to how healthy your yeast are. And also remove as much of that yeast as possible, because if that gets carried out through the process into bottling, that will generally lead to a lot of off-flavor issues during beer aging.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk about bottling and also storage. What's important there?
Keep it cold, remove oxygen, and drink it fresh.
Yeah. And of course, some people use yeast conditioning. That would help as well, because the yeast would then continuously reducing substances and consuming oxygen and produce more CO2 and possibly a little bit more SO2 as well. However, then how you handle the yeast later on, it's going to be another challenge. So like Pattie said, yes, very important at that stage about the PTO and also the temperature. Those are all very critical. Of course, you can't control how the consumers handle your beer. That's why I think earlier on in the process, you're trying to eliminate those precursors or the substrates for those oxidative reactions as much as possible.
Talk about another important thing there is to minimize the agitation of the packaged product. What's the deal with that?
I think the first thing is if you do agitation, of course, you have more mixture with the oxygen, and you would accelerate some of those reactions as well because the biomass exchange, etc. And then, of course, if you have floating material, and they would come up and they would act as surface for reactions as well. And like we said, if there's free fatty acid material, then they would again start to react. And I think there are a lot of other factors as well that's really related to the biochemistry of the speed of reaction as well.
Okay, I think you're going to talk about terroir a little bit in your presentation here in a bit. So I was wondering if you could kind of comment on to what extent does barley terroir affect beer flavor stability?
Sure. So with the latest research in barley terroir, so the regions in which the barley varieties have been grown, what we know is that there are varietal effects. But when we look at analytical assessment of LOX activity, as well as amino acid profiles, some flavor precursors that are in the barley themselves that can be released through the malting process, that generally leads towards environmental effects, which can sometimes be greater than varietal effects. And a lot of that research is very new, so we don't fully understand it, but we do see that the environment in which the barley is grown seems to affect the overall flavor potential and flavor stability of the beer that's made with that malted barley.
Yeah, I also want to add that although we don't understand a lot of the mechanism, a good phenomenon is that if we have the same variety growing in different continents, like in Europe and in North America, we'll see the difference. For example, the total protein content. So those definitely would be factors contributing to the free amino acid level, and therefore it would affect flavor stability differently. And same thing with, it's like the grapes. So the year, and then the terroir, and then the variety. So I would say, as summary, the G by E, by M, by S, that will be genotype, environment, the malting process. S will be storage, so GIMS, if you want to call that way, are all contributing very significantly to this whole endeavor here for better and fresher beer. I think there's a lot of evidence for it. So sometimes we think we are producing a European-style beer, but if we are not managing those parameters well, then the result may not be quite the same as you expected. So we need to take all those into considerations. But on the other hand, though, we do need to balance the quality of malt. So we can use barley that is very low in free amino nitrogen. However, it will not give us the beer. So that's an extreme case, of course. But if we just under-modify the malt to control the free amino nitrogen, then we have beta-glucan issues, etc. So that's why we see also maltsters are artists as well. So there's a fine art in processing a more balanced, high-quality malt for the brewers to use in their brewery and produce the best quality beer and everlasting for the freshness as well.
Yeah, and I'd also like Dr. Yin to comment on one more thing because I don't remember the specifics, but we also understand that there is a varietal as well as environmental effect on starch saccharification temperatures, which can affect your extract yield. So he knows a little bit more about that than I do.
Well, thank you. I think we're still studying that. And it's quite fascinating as well. Yeah, if it's different varieties or if it's varieties from different geography, because maybe the way the starch was synthesized when the barley was maturing maturing in the kernels, therefore the structure put together is a little bit different. For example, the linearity and how many branches you have, and how long the chain length is for the glucans, and those all affect the energy required to liquefy that starch. So that's really what Pattie is talking about geneticalization temperature. And sometimes for a brewer who is setting one temperature to do isothermal mashing, they may have to refer back to the crop situation and see if that temperature setting is sufficient to bring the starch into liquid, and therefore you can have better conversion later on.
You've said that barley amino acid composition is low-hanging fruit in exploring flavor, uniqueness, and stability. Explain that.
Oh, yeah. The way we said that is because we know, and there's evidence to show that the free nitrogen level in different barley are different. And then not just the total level, but the different amino acid ratios are different. And we know some amino acid would have more flavor impact than the others. Like in hops, we just found out, or people just reporting, the thiol groups have major flavor impact. In barley, it's very similar. The sulfur-containing amino acids, like cysteine also, they also have very, very strong impact on flavor. Methionine is another one. If you oxidize that into methanol, that will give you meaty, brothy, potato-like flavor. But if you have cysteine, for example, it will give you meaty note. So if you walk into a Chinese roasted duck restaurant, you will not smell it like roasted steak, because the amino acid in the duck skin is different from that in the beef. So that's how it would affect the flavor profile, but then the amount would affect the flavor stability, for example.
And one of those amino acids, we talked about proline earlier, it's not assimilable, which means the yeast doesn't uptake proline. So if you have proline can tell you a level of modification with your malt, but if you have too much proline available, that leads to off flavors that are very bready and meaty-like as well. And another area to look at with amino acids, as Dr. Yin was pointing out, the thiol-containing amino acids, they can also lead to sulfur off-flavor production in the form of H2S and this oniony kind of onion soup meaty aroma. So they all play a part, and we don't fully understand it, but I believe he's saying we have low-hanging fruit here, rather, because it's one of the few things we can measure, and we can bring it back to the variety or the geographic region.
Okay, we didn't get into it much, but you've also indicated that roasting operations have an impact on the radical level in malt. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Roasting can do a number of things to your malt. So as you roast the malt, you convert the compounds that are available into melanoidins or pigmented molecules. This can sometimes increase the radical content of the malt, so you can see an increase in radical formation, but it also can increase the way that iron is stored within the malt, and that storage of iron can impact flavor staling through Strecker degradation as well as other pathways. And then the other thing about roasting is that if you heat or roast your malt longer, you'll actually begin to kill off some of the enzymes associated with LOX formation.
Okay, very good. That's actually all of the questions that I have. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you would like to, that we missed? It's a big fat no from Pattie over there.
Well, I think we can just summarize it. As far as malt is concerned, there are several major pathways we can look into it. So one is the type of papery, cardboardy note coming from beer. That's from the fatty acid degradation oxidation, which is mediated by the LOX level in barley and then in the malt. that's why some people are pursuing for the low logs barley to start with. That's much easier. You don't have to control it in the kilning process, trying to inactivate that, because as a result, otherwise you would inactivate a lot of other enzymes, and then possibly you produce higher color. And the other mechanism is more the malty, the almond, the heat load type of note is more like furfural formation, which is more related to the thermal load, whether it's in the malting process or later on in the boiling or whirlpool process. The other one then is the last one we talked about is the Strecker degradation. That's more the amino acid aldehyde, which gives you different type of notes like meaty, brothy, soy saucy notes, etc. That could be very typical for all malt beers. And that is another different pathway, is more related to the residual free amino nitrogen in the beer if the yeast is not able to utilize most of the amino acids in the wort. So those are areas, but of course there are lots of other areas like exposure to oxygen, mineral content, etc., etc. But here, as far as malt are concerned, those are the three we'll be talking about, and we're trying to get better understanding of it so that we can help the brewers to produce better lasting and fresh, ever fresh beer.
That was Pattie, Aron, and Xiang here on the Master Brewers podcast. If you want to learn more about fan and flavor impacts, I'll add a link to the show notes that will take you to Pattie's 2018 Eastern Technical Conference presentation. Or you can just type fan into the industry's best search bar at MBAA.com. Did you know that Master Brewers now has a mobile app? TQ articles, podcasts, webinars, Ask the Brewmasters, and more, all in the same place. Search Master Brewers in the App Store to download it now.
I'm moving too fast.
It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. You can find all the details on the Meetings tab at mbaa.com.
Came around.